Alright, so this is my yarn winder, and I promised I was going to share a video of it doing its job. I apologize for the vertical video, but this was the best way to show exactly how everything works. So you start from the cone, and you want to make sure you start the cone. I actually went up and down about 4 times before I began winding. And I like to thread from this direction obviously right now because I'm adding a second ball of yarn onto this cone. But when you're beginning a new cone of yarn, you're going to thread the opposite direction. So the first thing you're going to do is come up here in this gap over the reversing screw, which is also a yarn winding barrel if you wanted to find one of these parts. Then you're going to bring your yarn up into the jaws of the knot finder, so right there. And this next part is a little bit tricky, and this is what took me a little while to figure out. This next bar here, this is the switch that activates the mechanism. So if this little bar does not pull up, the machine turns off, which also means if you run out of yarn, the machine will automatically turn off. There is what appears to be a yarn guide in the corner here. If you can see there in the bend, if I drop it, you might be able to see a little better. It appears to be a yarn guide, but what actually that will do is prevent your yarn from moving up and down the cone freely with the reversing screw the way it's supposed to. So I'm sure that's probably for some other type of winding, maybe thread, but it is not good for yarn. I think they might have just put it in here to stabilize and make this bar a little bit stronger because it is a moving component of the machine. So once you come up through, make sure the machine's turned off, otherwise you might just get a nasty surprise and a mess of yarn, which I just throw away because it's not worth the headache. You're going to thread it under the bar, so through the jaws and then under the bar. Then you're going to come up through this little tensioner guide, and that's the red plastic piece here. And the way the tensioner works, it's actually kind of old school. I'll take that out for now. It's your typical 2-disc tensioner, just like every tensioner everywhere. But what's different about it is this little plastic piece rotates. And as it rotates towards the back, like there, that's the least tension. But as it rotates forward like that, that provides more tension. And what determines how much tension there is weights that are put on this little hook. At least that's as far as I can tell. If I'm wrong, somebody correct me, but from what I can tell, because there were weights on this when it arrived, the more weights that are on it, the harder it is for it to be pushed back and the tighter the tension. So because I'm using a worsted weight yarn right now, there's no need for me to have weights on here, because with machine knitting, when this machine was created, most people didn't have bulky machines, as this is a studio brand. So this was before Singer and Silver Reed began releasing under those brand names. So next you're going to come up through the tensioner, but you got to make sure you're in this little yarn guide here. And what I do is I want to make sure that the tension is correct. Oh, I'm sorry. Looser tension is forward, tighter tension is backward. Forgive me. So I want it looser, so I'm going to bring it forward there. And then I'm going to put it up through the yarn guide here. And then we're going to go up the mast. Through the loop there and down. And since I'm working on a center pull ball right now, I've got to deal with this tangle. So now we're all threaded, and we'll show you a quick view of the full threading before we get ready to start. Now, making sure everything's prepped correctly, just as with everything in machine knitting. Making sure everything on this machine is very important. You got to make sure it's right, or else you will end up throwing away quite a bit of yarn. Ask me how I learned that. So the next thing you're going to do In my last video I mentioned that this rotates, and the reason it does that is, as you know, the yarn builds up to a greater degree on the bottom of the cone than it does at the top. And as this yarn builds up, this barrel is the same diameter from the top to the bottom. So by rotating, this allows the yarn on the cone to have full contact with this reversing barrel all the way from the top to the bottom. If this did not rotate, what would happen is all the yarn would stop winding at the top because only the bottom would be making contact, since that builds up faster. So that's why this does rotate. And as you can see, the owner of the yarn shop who used to have this machine marked in pencil back here for the different sizing. So I can do everything from thread all the way up to the cylindrical tubes that are not cones. I'm dealing with a knot here. Give me 1 second. You can pause it. This is going to be a minute. I'm sure you all understand. I think I've got it. Yay! All right. Here we go. So this was my center pull. And this is actually for a blanket for my daughter. So here we go. All right, we're all threaded up. The switch is turned on. Now, your very last step is to pull up the cone. Otherwise, it's not going to wind. Most importantly, as you pull up the cone, you're going to need to remove that slack, or else you're going to end up with a nasty loop on your cone of yarn. So you don't want to take up too much, because otherwise it's going to add tension. But you just want to make sure you don't end up with a loop of yarn, because that's going to give you a nice ugly tangle when you're trying to knit later on. All right, so then we press go. Here we go. As you can see, the yarn moves cleanly from top to bottom on the reversing screw. Now, I got a knot, and because that puts tension on it, will break the yarn, so I just am going to roll out a little bit anything that's got tension on it, cut it, and retie. I need about this much waste yarn anyway, so I'll just go ahead and start a new skein. But that is how the machine works, and it makes a perfectly professional industrial cone of yarn.